Okay, I think this is everyone, so let's get started. So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Why Corporate Social Responsibility Matters. My name is Natalie Varanya, and I will be your webinar co-host today. I'm here with today's presenter, Baillie-David, TalentMap Senior Vice President of Engagement and Consulting, who will be sharing his insights and best practices for implementing corporate social responsibility initiatives. So before I pass it on to Norm, I'll quickly go through today's agenda and a brief overview of TalentMap. So here's today's agenda. For today's webinar, Norm will be giving a quick recap on what we mean when we talk about employee engagement. He'll also be discussing the link between employee engagement and corporate social responsibility. He will also be providing a review of the top 10 organizations who are known for their successful corporate social responsibility reputations, as well as examples from TalentMap's own clients. And finally, Norm will be sharing some advice and tools to help you get started on your own CSR initiatives. So we will also reserve some time at the end to do a little bit of Q&A before wrapping up. So if you see on the right side of your screen, you should see a questions panel. So you can use that panel to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. And I will keep this list of questions until the end. If Norm is unable to respond at the end of the session, we'll be able to follow up with you by email. So for a very quick overview of TalentMap, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, TalentMap is a full-service employee engagement survey provider. We ensure our clients ask the right questions, that they analyze the data, and most importantly, that they act on those results. So we've been in business for 18 years, and in those years, we've conducted over 7,000 employee engagement survey projects. We have surveyed more than 1 million employees in North America and run approximately 500 employee engagement surveys each year. So here at TalentMap, we have one focus, and that's to ensure that we improve employee engagement with every survey. So to give you a quick example, this is a sample of a few of the organizations we've helped over the last 18 years. And as a result, we have a comprehensive industry benchmark to show for it. So now that you know a little bit about TalentMap, I will pass it on to Norm to get started.
Thank you very much, Natalie. What I wanted to do today was really give you a taste of some of what we're hearing in the field in terms of the link between corporate social responsibility, CSR as it's affectionately known, and employee engagement. We're not going to be talking necessarily in detail about how to set up a CSR program or what CSR means. What I'm really interested in sharing with you today is the link between CSR and employee engagement. If you're looking to this to help set up that program or what some of the features are, we're going to go into some of the best practices for sure. But the angle really is around the impact and the relationship between employee engagement and CSR itself. So essentially, we need to start with understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about employee engagement. And having had a chance to review the list of those of you who were on, or at least those of you who registered, many of those folks, so they're familiar names. Some have reached out to me in between, so you've heard a little bit of this spiel before. But that being said, there were already a lot of new names, and welcome to the TalentMap webinar for those of you who this is your first contact with us. So to understand the link between employee engagement and CSR, we need to start with a common view of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about employee engagement. And I like to explain this really in terms of what engagement looks like, as opposed to the theoretical or the conceptual descriptions, as you can see on the screen. That's a pretty well accepted description or definition of employee engagement, but it doesn't really paint the picture. The picture I want to paint is, imagine a recent customer service experience that you've had, whether it was at Tim Hortons, whether it was on the phone with an airline, or any other customer service experience. And in that interaction, you will have noticed or taken note of what that experience was like for you. And certainly you would have been very pleased, I would imagine, if you felt that the person who was dealing with you was bending over backwards to help you. Were they going the extra mile? Were they trying to do what it takes to help you no matter what their own constraints were? Were they making an extra effort? Or were they treating you like another number? Or like run-of-the-mill, this is just another routine thing? That difference, that experience really paints the picture of engagement. Because the engaged employee is the one who's going to go and bend over backwards to help you or their colleagues or their stakeholders or their customers. They're going to put in the extra effort. They're going to take initiative. They're going to go the extra mile. They're going to bend over backwards. But the key to understanding employee engagement, yes, we can recognize those behaviors, but those behaviors have to come from the individual themselves. These folks have to want to do those things. They don't do it because necessarily they feel they have to. They don't do it because they're paid to. They do it because they genuinely want to. And that's very different than what we used to talk about when we're talking about employee satisfaction or just happy employees. I mean, so often I walk into a leadership boardroom to do a presentation on their engagement results, and I get the comment from some guy or some lady saying, oh yeah, employee engagement, that's just another, this is just the latest HR buzz for happy employees. So tell us about the happy survey, right? And I still get that cynical view today in 2017. Well, they're missing the boat. And I'm hoping that we can explain and we can evangelize this concept, because it really is different. And so the trick to understanding engagement is essentially maximizing the number of employees that fit that bill, that fit that description, that want to, and I underline want to go the extra mile. What that basically means, the technical term for it is underlined on the screen, the discretionary effort. And we need to understand that, but we also need to understand how we as organizations can influence that. And there's two components in this model. There's the head and the heart, the rational and the emotional. And we're going to tie in CSR to how it affects that model in a few minutes as part of this webinar. But the rational part of it really is best understood by thinking about what was going through your own mind when you signed the offer to come and work for wherever it is you work. And you're most likely thinking about things like, is the compensation right? Or is there enough vacation? What about the benefits? What kind of office am I going to be working in? Does it have a window? All those kinds of things. Very, very rational, logical considerations. But the real game is really played at the emotional level. And there's one word in particular, and we're going to use that word throughout this presentation. That word is care. Employees want to feel that the organization that they work for cares about them as individuals. And when they feel that's the case, they're going to care back. And when they care back, they're going to want to put in that extra effort. And that's really how this works. But the key here is, well, we have to understand how we can influence that. And so we've got this model where you've got a number, we call these dimensions of engagement. Now take note of these in particular on the left-hand side. So there's 12 dimensions of engagement. All of these things can have some influence on that level of engagement, that sense of caring, that willingness to go the extra mile. And as we're going to see where CSR plays in this list. And you can probably guess where that might be. Is it in innovation? Is it in leadership? Is it in vision? Is it in professional growth? The question remains to be answered. But if we're doing those right things right, if we're doing what's important to employees right in that list, we don't have to do everything right, but if we're doing those 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 things right, you're going to have employees feeling very, very basic attitudes and feelings towards their job and their organization. They're going to be proud to say they work at the organization. They're going to be optimistic about its future. They're going to be resilient in the face of adversity. They're going to be connected, motivated, most importantly, inspired by the organization, what it's doing and where it's going. And that results in an emotional investment. They're going to be tied to the success of that organization, and feeling all those things, you're going to want to go the extra mile. And that's what happens. And so when you've got a critical mass of employees who are feeling these things, doing those behaviors, then you're going to see results. And you can see that on the right-hand side. I mean, there's a raft of research, 20 years worth, if not more, that link employee engagement to the customer or the citizen's experience, the stakeholders. Employees will stay longer, they're going to be more productive, they're going to come to work, so there's less absenteeism. So now that we know what engagement is, and hopefully we agree with that assessment, we agree with that concept, then what's the link, where does CSR fit into this? And essentially, you know, we'll go through what the research is telling us, but what we really need to understand is why there is a link between CSR and engagement. And it's when we understand that why we can actually design and implement CSR programs, maybe even at a very, very modest level. You're going to see that it doesn't take huge efforts and big budgets to do this right. So what is the link? Well, you know what? I don't think any of you are going to be very surprised to learn that, yes, there is a link between how people feel about their organization and its participation in social responsibility or being socially responsible and the level of engagement. Here's just a basic chart that shows you what we call this a scattergram. And that shows you these little data points really show you the link between what percent of employees in an organization will tend to be engaged and the same percent in that organization who agree or strongly agree that the organization is socially responsible. And you can see there's a linear relationship. There's a line that can be drawn. A pretty strong relationship. The higher the percentage of folks who agree that their organization is socially responsible, the more they're going to be engaged, right? And so, you know, no surprise there. This is probably what we felt intuitively. I think you'd be very surprised if I told you, no, there's no relationship between the two, and we'd end the webinar now. But of course there's a relationship. And there's a lot of studies that show that link between CSR, social responsibility, being environmentally responsible, and engagement. So the question becomes, you know, here we cite a number of different studies, but if I go back to this slide here, which is causing which? Is it because, are more employees engaged because the organization is socially and environmentally responsible, or is it the reverse? Or because what correlation shows us is just that there's an association. It doesn't tell us what we call causality. It doesn't show us which one is causing which. So which is coming first here? Is it the chicken or the egg? Do we need to be socially and environmentally responsible to engage our individuals, or are we going to be better at CSR if we have a higher level of engagement? And that's the key question that we need to understand here. We also need to ask ourselves, you know what? A lot of this has come from, those of you who know me online, you probably maybe have attended some of the workshops and some of the webinars that I've done on this. You know I've talked a lot about the millennial generation. And just like anything else, when this came to the forefront in terms of employee engagement research, there was that push anecdotally that said, you know what, this is all the millennials. The millennials are pushing, they're not going to accept organizations anymore, they're not going to go work for companies that aren't socially or environmentally responsible. This is all the millennials. It's driven by the millennials. That wasn't the anecdote. That's, you know what, that's the story that's out there, just the lore, and I hear that all the time in the boardrooms. But you know what, our research certainly doesn't bear that out. It's you know, you might hear it in the corridors and you might be reading it. It might be the narrative, the ongoing narrative, but it's certainly not supported by the research. I mean, there's one thing, you know, there's mixed. I mean, there's one study that said here 70% of North American students said they wouldn't apply for a job at a company they believed was socially irresponsible. But when you look at that and you look at the way the question is phrased, there's a huge bias in terms of, you know, how many of us would say in a survey we would go work for a company that was socially irresponsible? No, I mean, obviously we don't want to be seen to be doing that, and so we call that a social desirability bias. So I'm not prepared to accept that necessarily, that statement at face value. What I want to look at is in all of that benchmark data that Natalie talked about, in those million or so survey that we've done in the past. Is there a link? You know, when we've got that much data on that many organizations in Canada, can we see a link between age or the generation and that adherence, the engagement and that adherence to company values around social responsibility? The answer is no, we don't see it. You don't have to be young, you don't have to be millennial to want to work for an organization or to feel better about an organization that's socially or environmentally responsible. So it's not about the generation. This is something that's much more universal in terms of the link. So we've established that there's a link. We don't quite know whether that link is causal or not. Which way is it going? Which one's causing the other? We don't quite know that. But what we do know is it's not necessarily linked to the millennials. So to understand then where this is coming from and to establish that link, that's really what we need to do here. So I'm going to give you a dime store psychology lesson. And some of those, if you're in HR, this will be very familiar to you. There's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs basically says human beings need to essentially satisfy a group of needs in succession, and only once those needs are satisfied, then they can move up the pyramid. And there's 5 basic sets. So there's a set of psychophysiological needs. The first thing we take care of, we need to have food, we need to have water, we need to have warmth, we need to have shelter. And unless and until we've got those things, we don't care about the rest. And then once we've got those established and we have a warm house and a safe place and we're fed and we have enough to drink, then we're worried about our security and our safety. And once that's taken care of, then it becomes more emotive. We want a sense of belonging. We want relationships and friends. And once that's taken care of, it's about esteem and prestige and the feeling of accomplishment, finally looking at achieving our own potential. And we're doing this in the workplace as well. Because when we look at employee engagement, we see a very similar pattern. We start with a number of foundational needs that are met by the mission of the organization, its leadership, and our managers. And then we're looking to make sure that we have the physical needs met through compensation, our safety needs met through things like enablement, having a good workspace, things like that. And then it moves up very, very quickly from there to those needs around caring that I talked about before, belonging. So communications, teamwork, collaboration come into play. Self-esteem in terms of diversity, integrity, ethics, respect, innovation. And then finally, the ultimate, working to our potential in terms of that engagement. So where does corporate social responsibility, you don't see CSR in that pyramid, do you? Where does it fit in? Well, it fits in essentially in a couple of different ways. Corporate social responsibility, when you understand what it's doing and where it fits in, essentially addresses a number of these different boxes. And if you go back and you think about that 4-column chart that I was talking about, you'll see very clearly, and I'll point it out in the next chart, where it fits in. So how someone feels about the organization and corporate responsibility, it goes first of all to the organization, its vision, its values, its mission. And we'll talk about something called purpose in a second, which is really, really key here. It also goes to needs around self-esteem. We want to be associated with an organization that reflects our own values of integrity, our own values of ethics, our values of respect for the environment, for mankind, for our social mores and things like that. So corporate social responsibility addresses these needs, and that's how it's going to be shown to tie in to engagement. But fundamentally, this is about purpose. And when we're looking at CSR, what we're seeing is essentially a need to work for a higher sense of purpose. And one of the things that I said this doesn't have anything, isn't related to necessarily millennials as a generation, but one of the things that millennials did and are doing as they continue to enter the workforce, and I can tell you this very, very clearly from our research, is that millennials are putting the onus on where they work and going beyond the profit motive. So where we see and where this became an issue in terms of CSR was, you know what, you had a lot of individuals coming into the workforce that were saying, you know what, I don't want to just work for a company to make money for my boss. I need to have a greater sense of purpose. And essentially, that's one of the things that change. And of course, as the millennials become greater and greater in terms of numbers in the workforce, they're almost at 50% now. They'll be about 50%, I think, in 2020 or 2021. Well, that sense of purpose has always been there. But previous generations have accepted a sense of purpose that didn't necessarily go beyond the profit motive, at least in the private sector. But we saw it there, and we see it in terms of engagement when we look at different types of organizations that we work with, and we see greater engagement, all other things being equal, for a not-for-profit with a great sense of cause. Well, because there's a greater sense of purpose there. So one of the things that we're looking at when we're looking at establishing our own corporate social responsibility and tying that and hoping to have some benefits around engagement, what we need to be really doing is we need to be instilling and reinforcing and articulating and communicating what is our organization's fundamental sense of purpose. And I can tell you right now, if that is not articulated any better than we exist to make money for our shareholders, or we exist to grow by 10% every year for the next 5 years, you're going to have issues around essentially the engagement around that sense of purpose. And if we go back, let me flip you back to those actually I can go the other way. I'll go here. Essentially, when we're looking at what those fundamental attitudes are, people need to feel proud of the organization in which they work. And it used to be that we could feel pride in an organization that was successful. And in some cases, that's very, very true. In some sectors, I'll take the financial sector as an example. That's still very true. The company is successful, the stock price is rising, we take pride in that. We can tell others we work for that company, and that sense of pride exists. But in many organizations, people are looking beyond the profit motive. I want to feel proud to tell others about the company that I work with. And so that pride is instilled by not only the success of the company, but because of media and social media, it's becoming the reputation of the company. The brand and the external reputation drives that pride a lot more than simply the profit motive. I want to be optimistic. If I need to be engaged, I want to be optimistic about the future of my company. I want to feel that we've got a future, and we're going to have a future if we're contributing in a sustainable way. So you can start to see the links here. Essentially, one of the most important feelings, attitudes that the engaged individual needs to have to be engaged is we need to be inspired. And no longer is it true that we can inspire solely by the existence of our company or our organization to solve a consumer-driven or even an industrial-driven issue or problem. We're looking for more. We're looking for something that truly inspires us, truly makes us want to go that extra mile on behalf of that company, and that's that sense of purpose. And if anybody is struggling, well, how do I do that in my organization? The basic thing that you need to do is evolve from the superficial or the obvious reason why we exist. And the mission statements, I've seen so many of them, but they really don't do a good job in terms of instilling or inspiring that sense of purpose. And a great example I can give you here, I'm sitting in Ottawa as we speak, and we've done work for the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, CHEO. And the president of CHEO, Alex Munter, is somebody who's very, very well known in the community. He's known to be a very personal fellow. He's always walking the halls of the hospital. He's always recently there was a newspaper article about Alex where he was meeting with someone who just got out of the hospital and was basically giving him a tour of his own hospital to show him how he could be better at accommodation. He's open to that kind of thing. And if you think about doctors and nurses in healthcare, they generally don't have an issue around that sense of purpose. They're there to save lives and make people as comfortable as they can. They know that. And so they can be very, very engaged, even if they work in very dysfunctional organizations. But when you look at the orderlies, and you look at the frontline workers, and you look at the people that are not necessarily involved in the medical or the clinical part of it, what you have in many hospitals, and we've seen this firsthand in our own research, is you have a group of individuals that where, you know what, they're going through the motions, they're just coming in, they're doing, they come in, they do their thing, they leave, they're the typical not engaged. And then Alex one day he ran into an orderly, and this is Laura now, and he was saying, you know, Joe, what's the issue here? You don't seem to be very enthused today, as Joe was mopping up the floor. And Joe says, yeah, you know, I come in, I do my thing here. It's been 20 years since I've been working here. I mop the floors, I try and keep it clean, but you know what? I'm looking forward to retirement. And so Alex said something to the effect that, you know what, Joe? Says you should never, ever lose sight of the fact that you're here and the job that you do helps us as an institution in terms of saving lives. And Joe says, well, I just mop the floors. He says, no. You keep bacteria away. You prevent disease, hospital transmission disease, things like C. difficile, that help save lives. So you have it as an important role in that organization as nurses, the doctors, the clinicians. And Joe says, wow. And ever since that day, Joe has been basically, he's doing what he's doing. He's doing it with an extra verb because he can see that sense of purpose. Now he's been given that sense of purpose. That's what CSR does. CSR, through the vision of the organization, gives people that sense of pride, that sense of optimism, that sense of inspiration, and that emotional investment that then allows them to want to go the extra mile. So if we're looking to the answer of which causes which, it's the CSR, it's being a socially responsible organization that's driving engagement. Although the engaged or high-performance individual is also the one that's going to participate in some of the volunteerism that goes along with CSR. So it really is chicken egg, but which comes first? The CSR comes first. So I promised you that I would talk a little bit about best practices. What are the best things that we should be doing, we can think about doing within our corporate social responsibility programs, if they exist, and if not, I'll show you how it's so easy to set something up on a very modest scale. But if you look at the research itself, what are the things that the best organizations are doing to make sure that they're seen and are socially, environmentally responsible, and as such, engaging as many of their individuals as possible? Well, you know what? Like I showed you before, there's a clinical answer to this, and then there's what I would call a real answer. And you can read this list. It's well documented in terms of where it comes from the literature. There's a footnote at the bottom. But you can see here, you know, they include social issues and risk assessment models. They measure the cost of revenue. They're including social issues in their business decisions. And that's where it really comes down to it. I mean, lengthening decision times because they're taking social issues into account. They're taking advantage of their own internal stakeholders' creativity. They're involving other stakeholders, i.e. external stakeholders, formally and informally. We work with a South African mining concern called Anglo Gold Ashanti, one of the biggest gold miners in the world. And we do this on a global basis. And it's probably well known that the resource industry, mining in particular, has, you know, bent over backwards to try to be seen as socially responsible and sustainable organizations. And they essentially involve the communities, and they put together community, very, you know, they go into some of the most remote regions in the world, and they help develop communities, community infrastructure. And the cynics among us might say, yeah, that's sure. You know, that's a mining company, they got to do that, otherwise they won't get their licenses. And there's a lot of truth to that. But no, the point that I'm trying to drive home here is, you know what, they're involving their external stakeholders. So they have committees, they bring in civil society, they consult them, and they take into account those views in their own business decision making. The other thing to keep in mind is when you go in, and I do this a lot, when you go into leadership teams, and you can tell, you know, is sustainability, is social responsibility, Is it an adjunct? Is it something that we have to do to placate the media? Is it something we need to do, by the social committee? Or is this something that really that the entire leadership team feels is part and an essence of their business? And of course, it's the latter. The best practice is it's the latter. And finally, I think the green sentence at the bottom of the slide really sums it up the best. You can look at all of these best practices, and there's more that go with it. But fundamentally, what separates the leading organizations from the organizations that just pay lip service to CSR, the leading organizations are the ones that now have incorporated the social issues that they deal with into the fabric of their organization. They're not separate business issues. The difference between the best practice organization and the standard organization is the best practice organization is the one that essentially plans and takes into account those social impacts before they happen, as opposed to so many examples that I've seen where we make a decision that has an impact on the environment, our sustainability, it has an impact on the society around us, and then we have to backtrack. We have to do PR. We have to do issue management around reacting to those issues. That's the fundamental difference. And so essentially, if you're looking at CSR as a practice, if you're a large organization, it really is just like engagement, folks, just like engagement. It really is making sure that senior leadership buys into this lock, stock, and barrel, and it becomes part of their own social capital. It cannot be lip service. And so who's doing it right? Well, you know what? I laughed when I saw this list of organizations. And you're probably doing a little bit of a chuckle yourselves, because you're probably thinking, oh, sure, Microsoft, Google, Apple, the tech companies, the car companies. You know what? There's a couple of interesting companies. Lego, that might be interesting. But you know what? When you look at this, it's so easy to say this sounds so clinical. You know, I tend to be a cynic around this. And basically what I'm saying is, you know what? This list of top 10 organizations that are doing it right, you know, you can go research, you can Google any one of these, Google Microsoft and CSR, and you'll see all the volunteer programs, and you'll see all the contributions they're making and all that kind of stuff. This puts the corporate back into CSR, into corporate social responsibility. I want to talk about something that's a little bit closer to home. And so to do that, I want to talk about a specific client. Now, we've got a number of clients that are involved in initiatives, and I'm sure, knowing some of you have your own things going. So this is just one, I think, that struck us and me personally very early on. Northleaf Capital Partners is a relatively small investment wealth management firm on Bay Street in Toronto. And Northleaf Capital Partners has fewer than 100 employees. So we're not going to be doing these big community service projects. You're not going to have a chief sustainability officer in the company, that type of thing. But then what's Northleaf Capital Partners doing right? First of all, they're on the top echelons of our engagement. I mean, you can look, those of you who work with us already, you know what your own engagement score is. This company has 87%, 87. Now, you might argue, okay, well, they're a small company, that's easy. Well, even compared to the small company benchmark, it's still in the top 10% of that benchmark. So what is Northleaf Capital doing in terms of CSR that's so interesting? Well, the first thing they're doing is the president essentially has mandated his leadership team to participate in 4 volunteer events a year. And those volunteer events, they decided, of course, several years ago, they decided as a group, that leadership team, that yes, we're going to give back to our community, but more importantly, we want our employees to be involved in that. We're not just going to write a check, as so many other companies on Bay Street do, and they contribute to their foundations and what have you, and they get their names on plaques and things like that. No. What Northleaf decided to do was they decided to have an employee group, so call it a committee if you want, but a group of employees select a cause every 3 months, every quarter, and essentially the entire company was encouraged, I would use the word, to volunteer half of a business day. This is not a weekend, this is work time, this is a business day. a quarter to that volunteer activity. So the one that struck me was a couple of years ago, they went to, it was December, it was their end of their fiscal year and calendar year, and Northleaf, the entire team, went to the Yonge Street Mission in Toronto, and they volunteered to cook, prepare a dinner. And so there you had approximately, I would say, around 40 or 50 people, about half the company showed up for this. And they get big participation. Why? Well, because the president himself essentially rolls up his sleeves, and no matter what it is they're doing, no matter what activity they're participating in this case, he put an apron on, and he's chopping onions, next to the receptionist. And the receptionist who joined the month before is like, wow, I mean, what kind of company is this? The president's chopping onions, and I'm chopping onions, and we're doing this for the Yonge Street Mission. We're not getting any publicity for it. This story was related to me in a number of verbatim comments in a survey, but also in discussions with the group when I brought it up, and they explained it to me. And so what they're doing here is, yes, you can call it corporate social responsibility in a number of ways. What they're doing is, first of all, they're taking the onus and they're of their own volition deciding to contribute something to the community. But where this is having the impact on engagement is the leadership team is leading by example, in that they're rolling up their sleeves, they're participating. This is not about writing a check. And they're doing this hand in hand, side by side with any employee in the group. And what that's doing is it's demonstrating to employees that, you know what, it's humanizing the leadership team. It's making them appear vulnerable, and it's essentially making them feel like, you know, we're working with human beings. So often I preach in the presentations that I give about engagement to leadership groups that you need to be more visible, you need to be more approachable, you need to talk to your employees in an informal way. And in this one gesture, 4 times a year, Northleaf has managed to do all of those things and contribute to the community, instill that sense of pride, inspire their folks by what they're doing. And by the way, they're also very profitable. But the sense of purpose is really, it's not about making money for their investors as much as it's about making money for their investors so that they can give back to the community. And I think that really exemplifies not only what CSR should mean in its truest form, but how it's having that direct impact on employee engagement. And so, what about your own? If you don't have one, or you're not quite sure where this should lead, there's a couple of easy steps that you can do to do this yourself. And what I want to counsel is you don't need these huge budgets to do this. Usually your social or volunteer committee can do this, but there's 5 really, really important things that you should keep in mind. The first thing is set goals. Be very, very specific and make it help you articulate your purpose. Why do you exist as an organization? And can we expand that in terms of its social and environmental responsibility? Keep this targeted, keep the process targeted, keep very few people involved in terms of designing it, but stay small. I mean, there's no reason, unless you're a multinational and you're on that list of the top 10 that I showed you before, there's no reason that we have to make this huge. What we have to do is we have to focus on something that matters to stakeholders, and most importantly, from the engagement perspective, employees being, some of the most important stakeholders in that group. And let the employees lead, folks, please. This is what drives the engagement. It's that group, it's that individual initiative that employees are contributing, being included, all of those things, even if they're not included necessarily in some of the decision making on the company side. If you can let employees lead and drive this like Northleaf does, you will drive that sense of engagement. And of course, I'll have more, I can provide you some more details if you want to. So that's a little bit about CSR. I think, you know what, people make a big deal out of it, of these big programs, but when you bring it right down to it, it really is a question of doing something small, making sure it's focused, and instilling that sense of purpose that's so important. And the sense of purpose is what links CSR to employee engagement. So clearly there is a link, and I'm hoping I've helped you in this webinar sort of get the juices flowing in terms of how we can possibly establish that link. So on that note, Natalie, I will ask you to bring up some questions if we've got any questions. Folks, I hope you've contributed in some way to that.
Yep, so thank you, Norm. That was very insightful. I do have one question right here. So one participant, he's asking, so he's trying to get all employees on board with his CSR initiatives, but there are only a few who are really participating. So it's been very difficult to get all employees really engaged during their CSR activities or events. So he's wondering if you had any quick recommendations to get not only a small group of employees, but most employees engaged in or buy into his CSR activities in the short term.
Yeah, the trick really is to understand that this has to be employee-led. So if the initiative or the activity is something that's corporately driven or organizationally driven, you know, a good example here in Ottawa, they do the United Way campaign every fall, actually around this time. And what's happening is there's fewer and fewer people that are participating in that. Why? Well, it's because it wasn't their idea. It's not something necessarily that the employees would support. So if you're having issues around getting people on board, it's likely because it's not something, it's breaking that rule number 3, I think it is. It's not, or rule number 4 here, it's not focusing on issues that matter to the stakeholders or the employees. So you might have to go back to brass tacks and consult them, whether it's through some sort of informal survey or informal consultations to say, okay, what is it that would bring you out? What kind of cause are you interested in that fits with what we're trying to achieve as an organization? With Northleaf, you saw I was contributing back to the community and doing things and making sure it wasn't just writing a check, we were volunteering, we were giving of our time. And so if you're having participation issues, it's because we're not necessarily focusing on the issues that matter to those employees. So hopefully that's answered the question. Next question, Natalie, please.
Yep. So we have another question from Kim. She wants to know if you have any recommendations to get buy-in from senior leadership to build social capital.
Absolutely. What senior leadership needs to understand is the business case. And as crass as that might sound, you basically have to take some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier in terms of, you know, the CSR, it's linked to engagement, the links in terms of a highly engaged organization and its benefits in terms of customer experience, productivity, absenteeism, retention, all those things. And then CSR being one of those key drivers, that sense of purpose, is going to augment all of those things, not to mention the brand and the reputation of the organization. So when you put it in those terms, it's a pretty hard argument for leadership not to buy into. And if you put it on modest terms, leadership is afraid of a big budget item. Well, basically, where they're going to balk is if there's big investments involved. And it doesn't have to be. As you saw, I mean, a company of 100 or fewer than 100 employees volunteering a half day every quarter isn't a big deal. Yet it's done wonders for engagement and provided all of those benefits that I talked about. So keep it small, keep it focused, and essentially make sure that we're showing that business case in terms of how CSR is linked to engagement, is linked to all those benefits.
Okay, perfect. So next question is from Brenda. She wants to know if you have any suggestions for a very limited budget. They have less than 100 employees and no ability to volunteer during work hours.
Okay, then basically what I would suggest they do is if they can't volunteer during work hours, right away what that's going to do is that's going to sort of put a chink in the armor, because it's going to demonstrate that, you know what, their organization really isn't into this. So that's the core, you know, I would first make a case to do a sort of a split in terms of some on work hours, some outside of work hours. But next to that, I would still, I mean, time is a lot less. If you're looking at low budget, time is a lot easier to provide, give than money or dollars. And so we're sort of mid-October right now. You know what, you could start something through in terms of something very, very simple around the holidays. I know a lot of organizations, they donate, they get a group of folks and they put Christmas baskets together for the homeless, stuff like that, through Shepherds of Good Hope. In Ottawa, that's a big program. Every city's got one. So it's stuff like that. You're only going to get a few people, but that's what, that feel good, that's what starts it. And then hopefully you can get the organization to chip in time, effort, money to show that, you know, it's not just the employees that are doing this. So it's going to be a tough slog, but I think that's where I would start.
Okay, perfect. And then we have one more question. I think this one's a bit of a more general question around presenteeism. Akam is wondering, presenteeism is an issue less addressed, but is the bottom part of the iceberg, and can you highlight how to get there?
I'm not quite sure what the question is. I can refer you to our website because I've done an entire webinar on presenteeism. So yes, it's an issue, and yes, it's something that has to be taken into account, but it's something that really starts as a cultural issue, and that shouldn't scare you when I say culture. It basically means people need to be aware of it, and people need to, and certainly managers have to start minor changes in behavior. I'm talking in very generic terms here. What I would do is, sort of my mind right now is wrapped around CSR and engagement. What I would do is I would go on our website and you can pull it up there. We've got a whole webinar on presenteeism, and it'll go into a good level of detail.
Okay, great. So that is all the questions we have. I did, however, have a few things to go over before we wrap up. As Dor mentioned, we have a bunch of resources on our website. We have our blog as well as the webinars under our resource section. So we've been working very hard in the last couple of months to be able to provide additional resources for our clients and followers. We recently refreshed the blog and are adding new resources every week. So you can go to the website and check it out. As you can see here, some examples are the dollars and cents of employee engagement. So this one's a cool little blog because it includes a built-in calculator to help you calculate the ROI on employee engagement, so the savings and costs associated. There's hit a triple win with corporate social responsibility. So that's a great follow-up to this webinar. And then one last example is 10 key points to win executive buy-in. So that one also includes a bunch of tips to address questions that people are usually asked when trying to convince their executives to move forward with any initiative, including employee engagement and CSR. And then, there's also a checklist you can also download within that article, a readiness checklist for surveying. Okay, and then, so additionally, we have recently published employee engagement and action planning for dummies. If you haven't downloaded it yet, you can go to our website and you can order it. So the book is free, but there is a shipping fee. But if you go through our website and all of our content, there's a handful of discount codes around the website that you can use to waive the cost of shipping. So on a final note, we are recording this webinar, and the slide deck will be posted on the website within the next week. So you can keep an eye out for that, but we'll also be sure to email you directly to let you know when it's available. So that's our presentation for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.